Okay. When I was thinking about an appropriate title for this event, I was asking myself, what is the converging point between our first keynote address on Germany and the European Union, and then the second one by Professor Weiler, who I was told is on the way now from the airport, arriving from New York.
On the train, right?
Arriving from New York just for the talk. And what is the converging point? Well, I said, reminds me Shakespeare's "to be or not to be," that is the question. And then I said, okay, let's work on the matter of Europe. To be Europe, or to be more Europe, or less Europe? That is the question. And many of the papers are addressing this question, actually. But now we are going to have the cake and the cherry. I am going to introduce now our first speaker, who is Simon Bulmer. Simon Bulmer has been Professor of European Politics at the University of Sheffield since 2007, and Chair of the Department of Political Science from 2011 to 2014. Previously, he was a Professor of Government at the University of Manchester, which he joined in 1989. Simon wrote his PhD at the LSE, London School of Economics, on European policy making in the Federal Republic of Germany. He has written on the European Union, Germany and the EU, Britain and the EU, and has contributed to theoretical work on European integration in three areas: domestic politics, understandings, new and historical institutionalism, and most recently, critical integration theory. He jointly edited the Journal of Common Market Studies, which we all know, being in this room, from 1991 to 1998. Simon is one of the authors of the Oxford University text called Politics in the European Union, that many of us use. He co-edited with Lucia Quaglia a special issue of the Journal of European Public Policy on the politics and economics of Brexit that was published this summer. And his book with William Patterson, Germany and the European Union, Europe's subtitled Europe's Reluctant Hegemon, will be published by Macmillan in early December. So this leads me to remind you here that the object of our association is also to present to the members new research, fresh research on different subjects, new books, new articles, breaking new ground. We have a member of our association two members that just published a book, Israel's Path to Europe. I profit from the occasion to mention. This doesn't happen every day. Lior Herman and Gadi Hyman published this book. and one of our speakers is also going to publish a book, as I said a moment ago. So thank you very much, Simon, for coming from far away, from Manchester, actually. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that welcome, Alfred. I hope I can live up to the billing. Thank you for the invitation to the association and to the sponsors. And I am indeed going to speak about the subject of a book that I and Willie Patterson have just finished on Germany and the European Union. I just give one tweak to Alfred's introduction. It's Europe's Reluctant Hegemon ? And the question mark occasionally has got missed off in the production. It's important to make sure it's there. So I think I'm going to speak for around about half an hour, perhaps a little bit more, on this topic of Germany and the EU crisis, help or hindrance. The book covers the whole time frame, really, from the foundation of the Federal Republic. That's one chapter, and I will say a little bit about the history as I go along. Now I've got a clicker here, so can I operate this? Is anybody familiar with it?
It's switched on.
No, don't know. Well, I'll use. Yeah. Okay. All right. There's a pause, just to give me a shock. Okay. So the paper is essentially about German power and how it has fitted in with European integration over the time frame. A key motivation of European integration, right from the outset with the European coal and steel community, was to prevent German dominance in the European Union. A reaction, of course, to history. And I'll use the term hegemony a bit in this talk. So that was where the start of European integration came from. As we know, particularly from the 1970s, after the period when de Gaulle had there'd been a division of views about the future of European integration between de Gaulle and the German government. After that period, from the 70s, particularly during the 1980s, during the time when Helmut Schmidt and Giscard d'Estaing were their respective leaders, Germany and France became the kind of motor of European integration. So it's a period essentially where Germany offered leadership in harness with France in the European Union, and a number of initiatives, the European monetary system, the European Council, which of course has become the kind of strategic guide to European integration, were launched as part of those initiatives. But the Eurozone crisis brought German power back into focus 20 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. There were concerns at the time of German unification whether this was going to give rise to a resurgent German power, resurgence of German power. But initially there was a lot of internal preoccupation with the tasks of unification with the former German Democratic Republic. And there was a strong emphasis, not least in the policies of Helmut Kohl, on continuing the multilateral pattern that Germany had settled into in the period since 1949. But the Eurozone crisis changed that rather, and it put German power into focus, as I said, particularly with the policies that were inspired by Germany's distinctive economic philosophy of ordoliberalism, but which in parts of Europe, particularly debtor states, were seen as austerity policies, disliked policies, and this looked like Germany perhaps was developing into Europe's hegemon. I remember this terminology being used in debates at that time. There was a particularly contentious book in Italian about whether this was the Fourth Reich, so it certainly became a key issue. The interesting thing is that as the crisis has evolved, as I will argue, it's a crisis that presents a real challenge to Germany as well as the European Union, because Germany's development post-1949 has been as a kind of model of the liberal economic and political order. So this is why you always see Donald Trump and Mrs. Merkel not looking very happy when they're in each other's presence, I suspect. With the emergence of the migration crisis, the situation about German power has flipped. The argument that Willie Patterson and I were making in some of our articles earlier on in this decade was that there were signs of politicization happening in Germany. New powers for the Bundestag, the German parliament. New involvement of the Federal Constitutional Court. The Bundesbank, the federal bank, coming back onto the stage as a critic of the European Central Bank. But what there wasn't was a political force that was able to take advantage of these of this institutional opportunity structure. That has changed with the 2017 federal election. We've seen that trend continue with the Bavarian election last year. So all these developments have presented Germany's role in the EU, put it under the spotlight, hence the subtitle, Help or Hindrance. So that's a bit about the argument. So I will say a bit, first of all, about the history of German power, a bit more over what I've already said. I will then say something about the challenges posed by the crisis. I will look particularly at the Eurozone and migration crisis and what challenges they have posed, whether Germany's role can be seen as a help and hindrance. If I've got enough time, I might say something about the Ukraine crisis, a slightly different external one. And then I'll come on to try and shed some light on Germany's power in the EU, looking at different understandings of hegemony. Hegemony is usually seen in international relations terms. So I think that we also need to look at the domestic politics of Germany, and that's where I'll come on to politicisation. I'll then conclude on my argument, suggest perhaps the way things seem to be developing, and hopefully I've stimulated you during your period of digesting your lunch into some questions and answers, because I think we have time for that, don't we, Alfred? Okay, so now can I get this to work? No. Okay, I'll stick with what I know. So, German power and European integration. Okay, so the concern at the outset of European integration back in 1951-52 was with putting the heavy industries of war, the coal and steel industries, under joint control. This was, of course, a very different period, a period of divided Germany, of Cold War, which provided another rationale to European integration. During this period, Germany was pre-sovereign. Until 1955, it was under the occupation statute. It didn't have a foreign minister. It really was quite restricted in what it could do. It gained back control over those coal and steel industries, not fully, but from the international authority of the ruler. So European integration from the outset brought real benefits to Germany. It was a way of establishing credibility as a reliable partner for France after years of turbulence and war. And in the 1950s, once the pre-sovereign era had come to an end, with the creation of the European Economic Community, it then provided a market, an important market, at the time when Ludwig Erhard, the economics minister, was conjuring up the German economic miracle. So it brought economic benefits. It was an arena for political cooperation and economic competition. This semi-sovereign period, again, did not really cause any concerns about German power. The Cold War, of course, was a kind of restriction on what the Federal Republic could do. The vulnerability of West Berlin to the Cold War, the Berlin Wall and these kinds of developments was obviously a major constraint. Again, during this period of the 70s, just jumping ahead, Germany got real benefits out of European integration. For instance, the idea of foreign policy cooperation, European political cooperation, was quite an emancipating factor for the Federal Republic. We have to remember that in the early years, after that was established in 1970, we still had the Hallstein Doctrine, so Germany, apart from the Soviet Union, didn't recognize states that recognized the German Democratic Republic. There were difficult relations with Israel, for instance, so foreign policy cooperation helped German foreign policy. So all that built on Adenauer's commitment to the West, West integration, and to Franco-German reconciliation, European integration, the Atlantic Alliance. Those were the sort of foundation points of the Federal Republic. And certainly until the 1980s, when it started to become a more normal member state, really early stages, it acted as a model pupil. It would not be isolated in negotiations. Actually, when I did my PhD thesis, I looked at one of the first cases where Germany was isolated. This was on beer regulation, quite an important issue to Germany, but the law of purity in German brewing regulations was different from the other then 5 member states. So Germany is a strong adherent to the liberal economic and political order. Unification, we see the pattern continued forward with Kohl's commitment to more integration, the Maastricht Treaty, monetary union, and it's only really with the end of the Kohl era when Chancellor Schröder comes to power, 98 to 2005, that we start to see real signs of normalisation, a willingness to use the language of national interests, to not feel, to the generational change, to not be from the wartime generation. But even so, people were still arguing, academics were still arguing that Germany was a tamed power, that it preferred multilateral venues to going it alone. So now we jump ahead to the 2010s and the crisis decade in EU policies and governance, starting really with the Eurozone crisis, then the external crisis, the Ukraine crisis, 2015, the refugee crisis, from 2016, the ongoing Brexit crisis, then the emergence of Trump and a new global era. There's a number of sort of ongoing chronic problems over leadership, democratic legitimacy, growing populism and anti-elite sentiment in the EU. Initially, these seem like specific EU crises, but I think as time has gone on, there's a pattern emerging that these are a bit of a crisis for the liberal international order. So, at a time of unprecedented challenge for the EU that we have now, Germany has showed a bit of a mixed record on leadership, as well as having an eroding domestic consensus for European integration that has been, in a sense, the very foundations of its ability to use its power towards pro-European integration in the past. Hence the question, is Germany becoming a concern? Is it going from Muster, Knabe to Sorgenkind to a real concern in the EU? That's what I put out there for discussion. So, first of all, Germany as the indispensable power. So, we need to just think, why has Germany been pushed to the fore? And I think the first thing to note is that there has been a clear emergence of Germany as number one, and it's no longer the Franco-German relationship. I mean, perhaps symbolised most by the downgrade of French debts by the rating agencies in the Eurozone crisis. The Franco-German relationships power to shape the EU has also declined quite significantly in a European Union of 28 or 27. The sort of divisions, the cleavages across the EU are now much more complicated than they were in an EU of 12 or 15 member states. Also, a contributory factor is the lack of alternative partners for Germany. Italy, not really an option. Britain's departure, not an option. Under the Law and Justice Party, links with Poland have become more problematic as well. Actually, can I get a glass of water here somewhere, because I'm beginning to dry up and I don't want to come to a halt at some point. Yeah, or there's... Now, just talking about the... Thanks, that's great. Talking about the crisis era. The crises have really been critical because of gaps in policy regimes. Gaps in the fiscal surveillance regime in the Eurozone crisis, the failure to find a formula for dispersing those arriving from the refugee crisis, both meaning that there was no supranational policy framework in place. Instead, reliance had to be made on intergovernmental relations. And in the case of the Ukraine crisis, common foreign security policy is, by definition, intergovernmental in nature. So this is an important point, because the best guarantee, in a sense, that German power isn't a problem is to stick to the supranational methods set up in the coal and steel community. But the problems with these cases in the crisis years is that that wasn't an option. So it meant that intergovernmental politics came to the fore. And Chancellor Merkel, in a speech at the College of Europe, had talked of the union method in approving terms, I would say, and this was a kind of intergovernmental approach to politics. Alongside the crisis politics, we have a Germany that, of course, has economic strength. It has the kind of resources that would make you think it's got the ability to play this leading role in addressing the crises. Indeed, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, now the German president, but at the time the foreign minister, who returned for a second term as foreign minister in the government from 2013 to 2017, wanted to review Germany's foreign policy role. There had been a rather weak incumbency of the Foreign Office by Guido Westerwelle, the Free Democrat foreign minister, during the course of which Germany had refused to get involved in action in Libya, and this had led to concerns about Germany going its own particular route and not following its traditional multilateral pattern. So Frank-Walter Steinmeier initiated something called Review 2014, which is a review of foreign policy, invited contributions from academics. There was a road show across the country to try and see what role should Germany play in the global politics, in European politics. And its conclusions were that it should step up. But this is a challenge, of course, because Germany, in a sense, has got an ingrained pattern of leadership avoidance. That was one of the kind of lessons it learned post-1949. So that's the point at which we come to German power. Now I'm going to use the term hegemon. If I give these this kind of a talk in Germany, people immediately get very concerned about hegemony because of its negative connotations. I remember Thomas Ritter, who we heard about this morning, launching into an attack. We shouldn't use this terminology. We should use leadership. And I think the two things are different. Leadership is more about a kind of diplomatic power only, whereas hegemony captures structural power, power of ideas, and brings in other dimensions. So that's why I'm sticking with it despite Thomas Risser's encouragement not to. Of course, sometimes hegemon is seen as bad and leader is good, and I'm conscious of that. But I'm not really trying to use hegemon as a negative term. I'm trying to use it analytically. So, okay, at the outset, European integration was to try and avoid German power. Now we have some problems of leadership, so the question is, can Germany play that role? Well, this is where I think we need to look at different components of understanding hegemony, starting with structural power. And Germany does have some important attributes. It is now, post-unification, the clearest, the biggest member state with 82 million population, a third of the Eurozone GDP, an export surplus of some 9% of GDP. In 2017, it held the world's largest current account surplus, and for 18 of the 28 EU member states, it's the biggest source of imports. It has its public expenditure in surplus. So all these figures look like German strength to me. There's one, though, that we should mention which doesn't look like strength, and that is that it only spends 1.2% of its GDP on defence. That's in 2017. So it's developed this civilian power concept where it's not a major contributor to defence and NATO. In terms of diplomatic power, there are different roles that can be played as a shaping power, and Germany is a shaping power in the EU historically with its many initiatives. It's typically in the avant-garde, so if you look at all the examples of differentiated integration, Germany is part of that, pushing forward things like the passport-free zone outside the EU initially and then bringing it back in, and there are other instances like the Prüm Convention on Justice and Home Affairs where it's used this avant-garde approach to avoid integration being held up by the slowest ship in the convoy, which is typically Britain, of course. It has been probably the most pro-integrationist state, but this has cooled down, and the number of pro-integration speeches that you hear by German politicians nowadays is very small. I mean, the last one that I can think of that really caught the headlines was Joschka Fischer in 2000, setting off the kind of constitutional debate. In the past, things were quite different. I know that's partly because of Merkel's dominance and her, that she doesn't do that kind of thing. Diplomatic power is also about veto power, and Germany has, I think, started to use that veto power rather more, for instance, in the Eurozone crisis by blocking Euro bonds as a way of solidarity. You talked about solidarity this morning, Alfred, no transfer union, similar kind of thing. So veto power is also a power. Moving on to the power of ideas, I think ordoliberalism, which is a rules-based understanding of the liberal market order rather than a completely free market approach, has also been very important during the Eurozone crisis, as has the principle of economic self-responsibility, that debtor states should take care of their own situation. This is an interesting, the Eurozone crisis, in a sense, was an interesting clash between two principles of the Federal Republic: support for European integration and a sort of sound money policy that comes from liberalism. Those two things had to be weighed up, and in a way you might say ordoliberalism has triumphed, or at least further integration in the fiscal domain has had to be on the basis of ordoliberalism. That's been the way of squaring the circle. Civilian power foreign policy is another important idea that drives Germany's outlook, particularly relevant, of course, to common foreign security policy. We saw that in the Ukraine crisis, with a commitment to maintenance of international rule of law and so on. Germany is committed to the liberal order, rule of law, and liberal trading. Hegemony literature, I'm thinking here of the work of the international relations scholar Ian Clark, has also emphasised the importance of legitimacy. That hegemons in the past, whether it's the US post-war or Britain in the 19th century, have been dependent on the rest of the international community supporting their leadership. And that's a relevant point here, because German leadership is, never mind German hegemony, is not uncontentious. In the Eurozone crisis, the divisions between creditors and debtors comes to mind, the demonstrations in Greece of Merkel with a Hitler moustache, for instance, Indignados in Spain, and so on. But the difference, and then East-West divisions on migration, the Visegrad obstruction to German wish to redistribute refugees across the member states. The difference between the two cases is the power asymmetry in the Eurozone crisis. The debtor states were faced with an uncertain future of exiting the EU if they didn't accept money, so Germany could set conditionality there of ordoliberal rules as the condition for accepting that money. In the migration crisis, the Visegrad states were able to assert obstruction. They were able to obstruct what Germany wanted, and that's how we get into the particular stalemate in resolving that within the EU. The final point I want to make, and I'll come on to that in a couple of slides, is that if we go back to the Greek city-states, there's literature on them about how those states became weaker as international actors if their domestic regime crumbled. So on that basis, I introduced the importance of stable domestic foundations. And this is where politicisation comes in, because over this last decade or so, there have been increasing powers to constrain the German government from within, and now we have much more contestation of European policy to go with that. And that's where the question about whether German power is becoming a hindrance comes from. I'm not showing the Ukraine crisis. I didn't realise that slide was in there, so slight apologies on that. So now let me look at the Eurozone crisis and just think, was Germany a help or a hindrance? German economic strength was certainly a help to its influence in finding solutions, but I think, and to being the largest contributor to the funds to support the debtor states, but it was particularly the economic ideas of ordoliberalism and sound money and their emphasis on rules-based solutions that drove the reforms after the initial crisis, drove the reforms to the fiscal regime. Merkel's political prestige was important, again enhanced when France suffered its debt downgrade. There was, during the Sarkozy period, this so-called Merkozy set of initiatives which were presented as bilateral but influenced mainly by Germany. Another important support was the sort of grand coalition, I mean that with small g and small c, of support in the Bundestag. The votes on almost all measures were relatively uncontentious. One of the first ones, the SPD, abstained, but generally it was characterised by the main parties, the centre parties, supporting reforms, but with some divisions, dissenters in the Christian Democrat and Social Democrat parties. So as I said just now, the important additional factor was the power asymmetry between creditor and debtor states, and Germany was effectively the lead power amongst the creditor states, but with important support from other states like Finland, the Netherlands, and so on. On the other side of the balance, there were some hindrances coming from Germany. You could say, if you were trying to apply hegemonic stability theory, the sort of literature from the US post-war and actually interwar period, if you were trying to apply that to the EU, German trade surpluses are in fact a cause of instability rather than stability. Other states are obviously importing those goods. And another factor that was a problem was that German banks, which were sitting on a lot of funds because of the high German savings ratio, had invested quite a bit of that money in Southern Europe. So actually, part of the rescue was helping German banks as much as the debtor states. A hindrance, depending on how you would look at this, maybe a German wouldn't see this as a hindrance, was emphasis on moral hazard principles, but it did mean that the painful costs of adjustment fell on the debtor states. And at first, in spring 2009, there was a reluctance to act. All sorts of reasons put forward to this. North Rhine-Westphalian state elections, there's an important swing state for power in the upper house, or was it simply trying to make sure that the Greeks realised they've got to change their ways, and it was a way of enforcing conditionality? Well, there's probably a bit of both on that. I mentioned parliamentary dissent, so although there was a grand coalition of support in the Bundestag, the governing parties, particularly during the Christian Democrat, Free Democrat coalition 2009 to 13, where there was a small government majority, sometimes there was no chancellorial majority. Sometimes the government didn't get it through what it wanted to do on the Eurozone. With a government majority, it relied on the opposition to do that. So it obviously becomes then more of a calculation in internal politics. And then there's what Timothy Garton-Ash, the British academic, has called the 4 Bs. Bildzeitung, which tried to capitalise on what it saw as Greek pension benefits being better than those in Germany, sort of whipping up a kind of sentiment that people were getting a free ride at the German expense. The Federal Constitutional Court, which ever since the Maastricht ruling back in 1993, that it's a Staatenverbund, a confederation of states, has held a rather intergovernmental view of the European Union construct and has been open to appeals from politicians, economists, about whether measures taken in the Eurozone were constitutional, and there are several rulings, including one where the whole question of quantitative easing, whether that was effectively unconstitutional, where the future of the Eurozone was almost hanging on these judges' ruling. In fact, they referred it, for I think about the first case, to the European Court of Justice in Brussels. And we also have the re-emergence of the Bundesbank, which had been assumed to have lost its influence with the European Monetary Union, but under Jens Weidmann, was prepared to be critical of the measures that he had been present in agreeing in Frankfurt in his guise on the ECB Directorate. So, from reluctant hegemon in the mid-2010s, we come to the migration crisis, where Germany does really take a lead initially through Merkel's seemingly welcoming approach of Wir schaffen das. In other words, we can cope, it's a humanitarian crisis, we can take the refugees. And again, Merkel was the longest standing leader in the EU. She had support to her left in the Grand Coalition, so again there was a bit of a small GC Grand Coalition behind willing to accept that policy, at least at the outset. And later on in the crisis, she was prepared to play a leading role in diplomacy with Turkey on trying to stop the flow of migrants. But this policy then became really moderated as internal opposition to the integration of refugees emerged. So, moving over to the hindrance side, one of the deficiencies of Merkel's leadership was that she didn't consult except with Austria. And other states were then not happy to be bounced into a redistribution of refugees that they'd not perhaps agreed to from the outset. So that comes to this opposition from Central and Eastern European states who were overruled by qualified majority vote, then didn't implement the policy, and now we get the sort of opposition of Orban about cultural supremacy of Merkel and the German government. At the same time, within Germany, there's increasing critique in the Christian Social Union, the Bavarian Christian Democratic Partner. There's change in public opinion after the events in New Year 2015-2016 in Cologne, and rising concerns about security, number of security concerns, and finally the rise of the AfD. So, penultimate slide. We have then, within German domestic politics, a shift from a permissive consensus to a constraining dissensus. This is a phenomenon identified by Huger and Marx for a number of member states, but belatedly seeming to come into effect in Germany as well. But as I indicated, this started off with some institutional developments. And institutions are important vehicles of power dispersal in German politics. That was the design of the Federal Republic post-1949, learning the lessons from the centralism under the Nazis. So the Federal Constitutional Court, with this mission of a militant defender of democracy, has become a kind of tribune for litigation, sometimes really directed at supranational understandings of democracy in the EU, and the Federal Court, Federal Constitutional Court, having a more intergovernmental understanding of democracy. Along the way, the Federal Constitutional Court has empowered the Bundestag, for instance, on votes on moving to the single currency, on constitutional changes in the EU, and it's also empowered the federal state. So this institutional-led politicisation set the theme, but it's the emergence now of, or the breakdown of the centrist political consensus, particularly with the rise of Alternative for Deutschland, and now with the 2017 federal election, the weakening of all coalition, of the both main coalition partners, the ongoing electoral cycle. We've seen further weakening of the CSU, the SPD, down to only 9.7% in the Bavarian election. Really poor result for coalition parties. And my hunch and this is a hunch of other observers, is that this is going to make the Berlin government very difficult to mobilise on European issues, to make it difficult to push forward reform of European economic governance. So let me now come to conclusions. I'll do this a bit out of sequence. I think my conclusion is that German power and its moderation has traditionally been a help for European integration. But I think now with the rise or the breakdown of the domestic consensus, the challenge to it at least, is now shifting it more to a concern, to a hindrance. And of course that's got big implications for European integration, because there are a lot of ongoing challenges to resolve. The integration of migrants into Germany, finding a functioning EU migration policy. We've heard about Turkey and the number of refugees that are there, and that creates a vulnerability. There's the challenge of Brexit, where of course Germany loses a liberal economic ally. Trump's challenges on trade front and also to the liberal order, global shifts, coalition tensions, declining support, end of the Merkel era. These are all major challenges. What are the scenarios in which Germany's help or hindrance role is likely to play out? Well, I suppose there are three I can think of. One would be a revival of the Franco-German partnership, but I think the erosion of the political centre is making that less likely. Certainly Merkel has got to go on a kind of offensive, or the Grand Coalition has got to go on an offensive to do that. It's interesting to remember, I mean, this is only March this year, that the coalition agreement put European policy front and centre, largely as a result of the influence of Martin Schulz, who of course never got into the German government because he stepped down to get the coalition agreement approved by his own party. German hegemony, well, I think German hegemony is a possibility, but it could be German power but not being used in a way that's particularly constructive, in more obstructive manner, which would also be a problem. Or maybe we have the slow disintegration of the EU. Finally, that's the cover of the book, which appears in December, and I hope I've covered my brief, and with that I'll sit down.